So the S&P, those Mag 7 companies, which everyone knows the names, right? Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Nvidia, they are trading at about 22 times earnings expectations for the next year. That is above the average since the 90s, which I think is something like 16. Now,
let me just jump in a second, James, because I don't think the average person on the street, particularly Brits, think when you hear earnings, I don't think they necessarily understand what we're talking. That's just profit. So stock price is often measured as a function of profit. So if you make it, how many times annual profit is someone willing to pay for this company? It's a really simple concept. And historically, looking at the S&P as a whole, James is saying investors on average, were willing to pay about 16 point something, a multiple of current profits to buy the S&P 500. But right now, because of the concentration in these particular stocks, it's 22 times profits that people are willing to pay. And that is right at the top, historically.
Now, it's not actionable advice, right? Because we don't know. There's that old saying, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. So we're not saying, to time, and we'll talk about diversification and the importance of diversification. But when we start to field questions from our clients and even people who don't work with us yet about, they look and see the headline numbers, right? And what is shorthand for the U.S.? We're guilty of it here on the podcast, the S&P 500. So when there's 2 years in a row of 20+% returns on the S&P, everyone wants to pile in. Everyone wants to performance chase. They don't realize they're doing it, but they look and see, hey, the S&P has done 50% over the last couple of years. Why aren't I all in that? And that is arguably the precise wrong time to make that decision, right? You want to be in the business of buying low and selling high. What you are doing intrinsically when you see a run like this with one segment of the market is buying high and selling low effectively. So you have to be really conscious of that as an investor, that you're not taking on more risk, that animal spirits, quote unquote, in the market aren't leading you down the path that could overexpose you and lead to losses that you weren't prepared for. I think that's a key distinction when we talk about the S&P as shorthand, and something that it's easy to get wrapped up in a period of frenzy like this.
James, the 7 stocks we're talking about, the people are paying on average right now, was it 44 times or 42 times?
Something. Yep.
40 something times profit. Now, and that's what's dragging the S&P as a whole up to the 22 times that we mentioned. Is it possible we're on the cusp of an AI revolution that's going to book 100 years of history, and we're entering into a new era? Yeah, I guess it is. Is it more likely, and this is what Jason Zweig is saying, is it more likely, though, that the US has had a magnificent run, but the future might not be so magnificent? If the historical average is, I'm just making this up, the historical average is 10% a year, and we've had 15 years of 15% a year, or whatever it is, we've had some magnificent returns, and that means that in all likelihood, the future will be somewhat muted in comparison to the recent past. And therefore, rather than concentrating in an already highly appreciated asset, people should start to think about diversification if they're not already diversified. They should think about where the puck is going, not where the puck is.
It's easy to say tune out the noise, right? Even though we talk about it, and to some people it's entertaining. I'm sure a lot of our listeners. But having a plan in place, having that diversification in place helps you to do that very thing, right? So if you are overexposed tech, if you're heavy in the Qs and you've made a play on Nvidia and you're looking at Apple, maybe you are overexposed, and maybe you should consider, are you appropriately diversified for your goals? That key diversification being the tool with which you can ignore the noise. You can tune out the noise.
As well, you've heard concentration gets you rich, diversification keeps you rich. And I think concentration, what people are really meaning there are traders, people who set up their own company and concentrate in a single stock, or people who work for a company and accumulate stock through that. That's concentration. I think the mistake is when regular people take their retirement money that's earmarked for their future, even if it's not in a retirement account, and get concentrated, because you can really blow up your savings that way. Really
Absolutely.
Blow up your savings.
And unwittingly, right? It can be an innocent oversight. It's easy to get caught up. Like I said, when the headline shorthand of the S&P is doing well, it is human nature's instinct to say, I should be on all of that. And we saw it with the DeepSeek thing. Another stat that caught my eye in 2024, NVIDIA alone produced more than 1/5 of the S&P's entire return. So again, to your point, not making predictions, but we know that potentially they're in a vulnerable position. If there is something that derails this AI story, as you're saying, overexposing yourself to that segment of the market could prove dangerous.
Let's look back to 2007, 2008. I know Lehman Brothers did go down, and we recently watched Too Big to Fail. I read the book and we watched the movie again recently. It's a good movie. Takes me back in time to that period of time. But it turns out letting Lehman Brothers go down was a mistake. But that's kind of immaterial because the rest of the banks cratered. And they cratered for years and years and years. So James and I aren't talking about any of the Mag 7 failing. We're talking about the Mag 7. We're just talking about them not doing unfathomably well for the next 15 years as they have for the last 15. And that is very, very possible.
You could come up with any range of hypothetical situations, right? One of which you could argue, and we've seen some of this in the last, I would argue, 6 to 8 weeks, a rotation out of the heavily dominant stocks, right, tech stocks, into other segments, other companies within the S&P or international or Europe or UK. You may see that maybe the AI story starts to falter and that capital moves to elsewhere. So there is no predicting what's going to outperform this year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. The best you can do is diversify.